The vibration of Pump Station 4 is not something you hear. It is something you feel in the soles of your boots and the fillings of your teeth. It is a constant, low-frequency trembling, the tectonic hum of 13,000 horsepower pushing hot crude oil up the throat of the Brooks Range. I stood on the grating of the turbine hall, looking down at the number 2 main line pump. It was a massive centrifugal beast, painted safety yellow, bolted to a concrete pad that floated on piles driven deep into the permafrost. The air in the hall smelled of hot lubricating oil, ozone, and the faint, sweet chemical tang of drag-reducing agent. To anyone else, the noise would be deafening, a physical wall of sound generated by the Rolls-Royce Avon gas turbines spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. To me, it was just the baseline of existence. It was the sound of blood moving through a vein. My name is Elias Vance. I am 42 years old, and I am a senior station operator for the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System. And for the last 6 hours, I had been trying to keep a failing seal on the suction pressure control valve from tripping the entire station offline. I wiped a smear of grease from the face of the pressure gauge with my thumb. The needle hovered at 600 psi, trembling slightly. The packing nut on the valve stem was weeping hydraulic fluid, a slow, viscous tear that gathered on the steel and dripped onto the catch pan below.
"Hold steady," I said, my voice swallowed instantly by the roar of the intake. I reached for my radio, clipped to the chest of my fire-retardant coveralls. "Control, this is PS-04, Vance here. I've got the packing nut tightened on the PCV. Leak rate is within tolerance. I'm going to hold off on the bypass. Over." I waited. Usually the operations control center in Anchorage would crackle back within 3 seconds. They watched us on a wall of screens 400 miles to the south, monitoring every vibration sensor, every temperature probe, every flow rate. They were the brain. I was just the hands. The radio offered nothing but the rhythmic, static hiss of the ionosphere. I frowned, adjusting the squelch knob. "OCC, this is PS-04, radio check. Over." Silence. Just the turbine singing its violent song. I looked up at the strobe light mounted on the ceiling. It was not flashing. No alarms. No scatter warnings on the local panel. Just a dead line. It was not uncommon for the atmospheric conditions in the past to kill the HF radio, but the satellite link usually held. I turned back to the valve. The radio could wait. The crude could not. The oil leaving my station was 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside the insulated metal walls of the module, the ambient air temperature was 35 degrees below zero. That thermal differential was the only thing keeping us alive. The oil had to move. If it stopped, it cooled.
If it cooled, it turned into a gel. Then a solid, waxy plug, 4 feet in diameter and 800 miles long. If that happened, the pipeline was not just shut down, it was dead. And if the pipeline died, the small topping plant that siphoned off crude and refined it into fuel for my turbines would starve. Then the heat goes out. Then I freeze. I took a 24-inch pipe wrench from my tool belt. The steel was heavy, cold despite the heat of the room. I set the jaws onto the gland nut of the weeping valve. I did not jerk it. You do not jerk steel under pressure. I leaned into it, applying slow, steady pounds of torque, feeling the metal yield through the handle. The weep slowed. A final quarter turn. The drip stopped. I wiped the wrench clean with a rag and slotted it back into my loop. Job done. Now, the radio.
I walked out of the turbine hall, passing through the heavy sound-dampening double doors that separated the machine-deafening roar from the administrative silence of the control room. The sudden drop in decibels always made my ears ring. The control room was a sterile box of beige panels, blinking LEDs, and the hum of computer fans. I sat in the operator's chair and looked at the primary HMI screen. The pipeline flow was steady at 500,000 barrels per day, but the data link icon, the little green chain in the corner of the screen, was red. COM failure. I tapped the keyboard, bringing up the diagnostic log.
The connection had been severed at 0814. It was now 1400. 6 hours. I had been in the turbine hall longer than I thought. I picked up the satellite phone from its cradle on the desk. I dialed the emergency line for the Anchorage OCC. The line did not ring. It gave a fast, erratic tone, like a busy signal that was hyperventilating. I tried the pump station at Chandalar Shelf, 70 miles south. Same tone. I tried pump station 3, north on the slope. Same tone. I set the phone down. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of my neck, distinct from the draft in the room. Comms outages happened, but a total blackout across satellite, microwave, and fiber simultaneously? That was not weather. That was infrastructure failure. I stood up and walked to the window. The glass was triple-paned, thick as an aquarium tank. Outside, the world was a study in grayscale. The Brooks Range rose up like the teeth of a dead god, jagged limestone peaks stripped bare by the wind. The sun was a low, pale coin rolling along the southern horizon, offering no heat, only a flat, sterile light that cast long blue shadows across the snow. The pipeline ran past the window, elevated on its vertical support members. It looked like a silver vein stitched across the white skin of the valley. I saw movement near the main gate. I grabbed the binoculars from the sill, 10 by 50s. I brought them to my eyes and dialed the focus. The gate was a heavy chain-link slider topped with razor wire. Outside, a vehicle was parked. It was not one of our Blue Company trucks. It was a private SUV, dark-colored, caked in road salt and frozen mud. The driver's side door was open. A figure was stumbling toward the gate keypad. I narrowed my eyes. The man was not wearing a parka. He was in a flannel shirt and jeans. At minus 35, that's a death sentence measured in minutes. He moved with a jerky, spasmodic gait, like a marionette with tangled strings. He reached the keypad and slammed his hand against it, not typing, just hitting it. I hit the talk back button on the console. Main gate, this is control. Identify. The figure stopped. He looked up at the camera mounted on the pole. Through the binoculars, I saw his face. It was frostbitten, white patches blooming on his cheeks and nose. But it was the eyes that made my stomach turn over. They were wide, blown pupils, staring at nothing. And there was blood, dark, frozen smears running from his ears and nose. He did not speak. He just opened his mouth and screamed. It was a silent scream behind the glass, but I could see the cords of his neck straining. He threw himself against the gate, the chain link rattling under the impact. Then he fell. He did not crumple. He went rigid and tipped over like a felled tree. He twitched once in the snow, and then the cold took him. I lowered the binoculars. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the monitors. The pressure in the line had not changed. The turbines were still spinning. The world inside the fence was operating within normal parameters. The world outside had gone mad.
I needed to secure the station. I pulled on my extreme weather gear, the heavy red parka with the reflective stripes, the insulated bibs, the bunny boots that looked like white rubber clown shoes but were the only things that kept your toes from turning black. I grabbed a pry bar and a master ring of keys. I exited the control building and stepped into the utilidor, the enclosed, heated walkway that connected the living quarters, the shop, and the plant. It was a long, corrugated steel tunnel, lit by fluorescent tubes. I walked fast, the rubber soles of my boots squeaking on the linoleum. First stop, the vehicle maintenance bay. I entered the garage. The air here was cooler, smelling of diesel and old rubber. Our snowcat, a Tucker snowcat with 4 independent tracks, sat in the center bay. Beside it was a Ford F-350 with a block heater plugged into the wall. I went to the roll-up door controls. I cut the power to the openers. I took a padlock from the supply cage and locked the chain hoist. No one was opening these doors from the outside without a torch. I moved to the personnel door. I opened it and looked out.
The cold hit me like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture inside my nose. The wind was picking up, blowing snow snakes across the asphalt pad. I checked the locking mechanism. It was a standard industrial deadbolt. Not enough. I went to the welding rack in the corner of the shop. I grabbed a piece of scrap angle iron, 2 feet long, 1/4 inch thick. I fired up the cordless drill, drove 4 pilot holes into the steel door frame, and bolted the angle iron across the door at waist height using heavy lag screws. I ratcheted them down until the washers bit into the metal. The door was now fused to the frame. I repeated the process at the rear exit of the living quarters. When I reached the front entrance, the main glass vestibule, I paused. This was the weak point. Double glass doors. I could not weld glass. I went back to the shop and found a pallet of plywood sheets we used for concrete forms. I dragged 3 sheets to the vestibule. It took me 20 minutes to measure and cut them with a circular saw. The whine of the saw blade biting into the wood was sharp and aggressive, flinging sawdust into the air. I screwed the plywood directly into the aluminum frame of the doors, layering it inside and out. I blocked the view. I blocked the light. I turned the glass entry into a wood-paneled wall. I was sealing myself in. Back in the control room, I stripped off the parka. I was sweating, a dangerous thing in the Arctic, but inside the envelope of the station, the air was dry and 70 degrees. I sat back at the console. The figure at the gate was still there, a dark mound rapidly being covered by drifting snow. The satellite phone rang. The sound was so unexpected I nearly knocked my coffee mug over. It was not the erratic, busy tone, it was a ring. I snatched it up. Vance, PS04. Elias. The voice was garbled, digital artifacts chewing on the syllables. It was Miller, the lead controller at OCC Anchorage. He sounded like he was speaking from inside a crushing machine. Miller, I have a casualty at the gate. Comms are down. What is happening? Listen to me, Miller said. He was not panicking, which was worse. He sounded resigned. The quarantine failed. It's not just the clusters, it's airborne or water. We do not know. The city is gone, Elias. The center is compromised. We are initiating the Omega Protocol. My blood ran cold. Omega? That's a scuttling protocol. Miller, you can't. We can't leave the pressure, Miller said. If the systems fail unmanned, the pipe ruptures. We spill millions of barrels into the watershed. The EPA regs. He let out a dry, hysterical laugh. Habit. Listen. We are sending a command to shut down the line. Close the remote gate valves. Drain the vertical loops. If you shut down the flow, I said, my voice rising. I lose friction heat. I lose the topping plant. My turbines starve. I freeze to death in 48 hours. I know, Miller said. I'm sorry, Elias. You're the only one up there. The relief bird, they did not make it out of Fairbanks. It's just you. The logic command is already sent. It's cascading north. It'll hit you in 10 minutes. Miller, do not do this. I can override. You cannot. It's a hard-coded safety logic. It locks out local control to prevent rogue operation. It's over. Make your peace, brother. Anchorage out. The line clicked. Then the busy tone returned. The hyperventilating drone. I stared at the phone. 10 minutes. The Omega Protocol was not just a shutdown. It was a kill switch. It would close the main valves, vent the pressure, and trip the turbines. It would turn Pump Station 4 into a tomb. I looked at the SCADA screen. The flow was still green, but I could see the indicators for Pump Station 5, south of me, blinking yellow. Valve status. Traveling. It was coming up the pipe. I did not have time to hack the code. The PLCs, programmable logic controllers, were encrypted industrial hardware. I could not stop the signal from reaching the computer, but I could stop the computer from reaching the machinery. I grabbed my tool bag and sprinted. I ran out of the control room, down the hallway, bursting through the double doors into the switchgear room. This was the electrical heart of the station. Rows of gray cabinets filled with breakers, relays, and heavy copper bus bars. The air hummed with 4,160 volts. I scanned the labels. Unit 1, turbine control. Unit 2, turbine control. Station suction valve. Station discharge valve. If the computer sent the signal, it would energize a solenoid. That solenoid would trip the breaker or fire a pneumatic actuator. I needed to sever the brain from the body. I dropped to my knees in front of the Unit 2 turbine control cabinet. I used a flathead screwdriver to turn the quarter-turn latches. The door swung open. Inside was a nightmare of wiring, hundreds of numbered terminal blocks. I pulled the schematic from the pocket on the door. My finger traced the lines. ESD logic loop, trip coil 24-volt DC. Wire number 402A. I found the terminal block. My hands were shaking. I forced them to stop. Precision. If I cut the wrong wire, I might trip the turbine myself. If I cut the power to the fuel governor, the engine dies. I needed to cut the trip signal. I found 402A, a thin red wire buried in a bundle. I reached in with my side cutters. The jaws of the pliers clamped around the insulation. 7 minutes. 5. I squeezed. The wire parted with a soft snip. I quickly capped the bare end with a wire nut and wrapped it in electrical tape. Now the valves. I ran to the mainline valve control cabinet. Same process. Find the ESD signal, cut it. I was sweating profusely now, the sweat stinging my eyes. I moved to the Unit 1 cabinet. Snip, cap, tape. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered. A klaxon began to sound, a harsh, rhythmic braying that echoed off the metal walls. Alarm. Remote shutdown command received. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of the turbines spinning down, waiting for the terrible silence. The klaxon wailed, but beneath it, the floor kept vibrating. The low-frequency hum did not waver. The Avons were still screaming. I slumped against the metal cabinet, gasping for air. The computer was screaming at the machinery to die, but I had cut its vocal cords. I stood up and walked back to the control room. The SCADA screen was a sea of flashing red alarms. ESD failure, valve misgo, turbine overspeed risk,
Local override. I sat down and silenced the audible alarm. The room went quiet, save for the hum of the fans. I looked at the flow rate. 500,000 barrels per day. The oil was still moving. The heat was still generating. I was effectively riding a bomb. By disconnecting the safety systems, I had removed all the automated protections. If a bearing seized, if a pressure spike hit, the computer would not save me. The turbine would just keep spinning until it tore itself apart or exploded. I was flying the station manual. I walked to the window.
The snow had covered the man at the gate completely. He was just a bump in the drift now. I checked my watch. 14:45. I had power. I had heat. I had water in the storage tanks. I had a warehouse full of filters, gaskets, and tools. But I was the only human being in an 800-mile radius who was currently warm. I went to the whiteboard on the wall, where the shift supervisor usually wrote the daily safety topic. I erased slips, trips, and falls. I took the marker and wrote, Priorities. Maintain flow. No flow equals death. Secure topping plant. No fuel equals death. Inverge calories. Do not freeze. I capped the marker. The smell of the solvent was sharp in the recycled air. I turned back to the console. The red light on the sat phone blinked. No signal. I was the captain of a stationary ship in a frozen ocean. All right, Elias, I said to the empty room. My voice sounded flat, absorbed by the acoustic tiles. Shift starts now. I pulled up the schematics for the topping plant. If I was going to survive, I needed to become a refiner. The crude oil running through those pipes was useless to me in its raw form. I needed to distill it into JP8 for the turbines and diesel for the generators. The little refinery module on the south side of the pad was automated, but it was finicky. It relied on heat exchangers and precise column temperatures. I grabbed my radio. PSO4 to... Nobody, I muttered. I clipped it on anyway. Habit. I left the control room and headed for the mess hall. I needed to eat before I went out to check the refinery. The adrenaline crash was coming, and my hands were starting to tremble again. The mess hall was spotless. Stainless steel counters, industrial coffee machines, tables bolted to the floor. It was designed to feed a crew of 20. I walked into the pantry. It was a walk-in dry storage room lined with metal shelves. Cans of Cisco peaches, 50-pound bags of rice, boxes of pasta, jars of peanut butter the size of paint buckets. I did a mental calculation. I had enough food for 20 men for a month. For one man, I had years. Assuming the heating stayed on. Food was not the problem. Spare parts were the problem. I grabbed a protein bar and tore the wrapper with my teeth. I chewed mechanically, staring at the label on a can of green beans. I needed to inventory the warehouse. I needed to check the inventory of turbine blades, fuel filters, and especially the consumable chemicals, the anti-icing additive and the drag-reducing agent. But first, the perimeter. I finished the bar and pulled my parka back on. The silence of the station was heavy now. Before, the emptiness felt like solitude. Now, it felt like siege. I walked back to the utilidor and out to the vehicle bay. I checked my bolts on the door. Solid. I climbed into the cab of the F-350. I grabbed the shotgun from the rack behind the seat. A Remington 870 Marine Magnum. We kept it for bears. I checked the tube. Loaded. Slugs. I stepped out of the truck and slung the shotgun over my shoulder. The cold steel of the receiver bit through my jacket.
I walked the internal perimeter of the fence line. The wind was howling now, a banshee shriek that tore at my hood. The snow was hard, driven horizontally, stinging my exposed skin like sandblast grit. I checked the transformer yard. The hum of the step-down transformers was a comforting B-flat. I checked the fuel storage tanks. The level gauges on the day tanks were full. I checked the topping plant module. It was a small, separate building, warm inside, filled with the smell of cooking hydrocarbons. The distillation column was hissing softly. The sight glass showed clear, amber fluid. Jet fuel. Good quality. I patted the side of the heat exchanger. "Keep cooking," I whispered. I walked back toward the main building. The wind pushed me, trying to knock me off balance. I stopped at the corner of the turbine hall. There was a camera mount there, overlooking the South Valley. I looked south. The pipeline stretched out, vanishing into the whiteout. Somewhere down that line, valves were closing. Stations were dying. The oil was stopping. But not here. I had severed the nerve. The heart was still beating. I looked at the thermometer mounted on the wall. 38 degrees Fahrenheit. I shivered. A violent spasm that ran from my shoulders to my hips. It was not just the cold. It was the realization of the scale of the task. I was an engineer. I fixed things. But I had never tried to keep a complex industrial organism alive solely by willpower. I keyed the keypad on the personnel door, the beep of the buttons sounding dull in the wind. I stepped inside the airlock, the warmth washing over me. I stripped off the gear, hanging the parka on its hook. I walked back to the control room. The alarms were still flashing on the screen, a Christmas tree of warnings. Remote signal lost. ESD bypass active. Safety interlock open. I sat in the chair. I put my feet up on the console, right next to the red button that would shut it all down. I folded my hands over my stomach. "Let's see how long we can run," I said. Outside, the wind slammed against the glass, but the glass held. Beneath me, the turbines roared. The oil moved. The heat radiated. I was the anchor, and I was not letting go. The first rule of industrial survival is that alarms are information, but constant alarms are noise, and noise induces fatigue. I sat in the command chair, bathed in the strobing red light of the annunciator panel. The silence I had engineered by cutting the speaker wire was heavy, but the visual assault remained. Every square on the grid was illuminated in angry crimson. ESD bypass, remote comms fail, valve misnull, PLC watchdog error, PLC watchdog. The board looked like a city burning from a satellite view. I could not fix the world, but I could fix the board. I stood up and walked to the wall of breakers behind the console. I located the circuit labeled Annunciator Panel Lighting. I flipped the toggle. The room plunged into the cool, neutral gray of the emergency standby lighting and the soft blue glow of the monitors. The frantic red pulsing stopped. My shoulders dropped an inch. Now I could think. I had effectively performed a lobotomy on Pump Station 4. The brain, the remote OCC in Anchorage, was gone. The autonomic nervous system, the local safety logic, was severed. The station was now a manual beast, a collection of 13,000 horsepower engines and high-pressure hydraulics that would run until they broke. My job was to be the nervous system. I pulled the station logbook from the shelf. It was a heavy binder with a vinyl cover that smelled of off-gassing plastic. I opened it to a fresh page and smoothed the paper. I checked my watch. 15:30. I wrote, Day 1. Omega Protocol initiated by OCC. Local override active. Station manning, 1. Status, critical, stable. I capped the pen and looked at the HMI screens. The most critical number on the display was not the flow rate. It was the fuel tank level in the topping plant. The Rolls-Royce Avon turbines that drove the pumps were voracious.
They were essentially jet engines bolted to the floor, and they drank fuel with the thirst of a machine designed to defy gravity. We did not truck fuel in. The logistics of hauling diesel 800 miles up the Dalton Highway in winter were impossible. Instead, we made it. The topping plant sat 200 yards away on the pad. It was a miniature refinery, sipping crude oil from the main line, heating it, distilling it, and splitting it. The light ends, naphtha and gas, went into the turbine fuel tanks. The heavy ends, tar and wax, were injected back into the crude stream to head south to Valdez. If the topping plant failed, the day tanks would run dry in 12 hours. Then the turbines would flame out. Then the crude would stop. Then the friction heat would dissipate. Then the station would freeze into a monolith of ice and wax. I needed to put eyes on the refinery. I went to the mudroom and began the ritual of layering. The thermal base layer, the fleece mid-layer, the heavy Carhartt bibs. I sat on the bench to pull on the bunny boots. The white rubber was stiff with cold, and I had to stomp my heels to seat them. I checked the valve on the vapor barrier boots. Open, to let the air pressure equalize. I grabbed the portable gas detector, a 4-gas monitor that sniffed for oxygen, combustibles, carbon monoxide, and hydrogen sulfide. I clipped it to my collar. H2S was the silent killer in crude oil. One breath at high concentration, and your nervous system simply shuts down. You fall before you hit the floor. I exited the living quarters into the utilidor. The metal tunnel was 60 degrees, smelling of floor wax and stale heated air. I walked its length, the fluorescent tubes humming overhead, until I reached the heavy fire door leading to the outside. I pushed the bar. The wind caught the door and ripped it from my grip, slamming it against the exterior stop with a violence that vibrated through my arm. The world outside was a white void. The wind chill was approaching 60 below zero. It was a physical weight, pressing against my goggles, finding the microscopic gaps in my scarf. I leaned into the gale, walking with a wide stance to keep my footing on the ice-glazed asphalt. The topping plant module loomed ahead, a rectangular steel box venting steam from its exhaust stack. The steam was instantly sublimating into ice crystals, creating a glittering fog around the structure. I reached the access door and punched the code. The lock solenoid was sluggish, freezing up. I had to shoulder the door to break the rim of ice that had formed around the seal. I stumbled inside and slammed the door, leaning back against it to engage the latch. The noise inside was different from the turbine hall. It was not a roar. It was a hiss, a high-pressure, sibilant whisper of fluids moving through pipes at extreme temperatures. The air was hot, 80 degrees, and thick with the smell of kerosene and hot metal. I stripped off my fogged goggles and wiped the sweat from my forehead. The thermal shock of moving from -60 to +80 made my skin prickle. I walked the inspection gangway. The distillation column rose 20 feet in the center of the room, wrapped in silver insulation. I checked the sight glass on the reboiler. The liquid level was bouncing rhythmically, a sign of boiling. That was good. I moved to the product rundown line. This was where the refined fuel came out. There was a sample spigot. I pulled a glass jar from the rack and placed it under the spout. I cracked the valve. The fluid shot out, hot and amber-colored. I filled the jar halfway and shut the valve. I held it up to the light. It was clear. No haze. That meant no water.
I swirled it. The viscosity looked right, like warm vegetable oil. But the pressure gauge on the instrument air supply caught my eye. The needle was vibrating near 60 psi. It should have been 90. Instrument air is the blood of automation. It's dry, compressed air used to open and close the pneumatic control valves. If the pressure dropped, the valves would fail safe, which usually meant they would close. If the fuel valve closed, the refinery stopped. I traced the copper tubing back to the air dryer unit in the corner.
It was a twin-tower desiccant system, designed to pull moisture out of the compressed air. One of the towers was covered in frost. "Damn it," I whispered. The automatic cycle timer had stalled. The dryer was not switching towers, which meant one tower was saturated with moisture and freezing up, blocking the airflow. The Omega Protocol shutdown signal must have scrambled the timer logic, or the solenoid had simply frozen in the open position. I could not fix the software. I had to fix the plumbing. I knelt on the grating, the heat of the floor pressing through my pants. I opened my tool bag and pulled out a set of crescent wrenches and a tube of thread sealant. I needed to bypass the timer and force the valves to switch manually. The solenoid valve block was a small aluminum manifold with plastic air lines feeding into it. I tapped the side of the solenoid with the handle of my screwdriver. The metal rang with a dull, solid thud. Frozen. I pulled a propane torch from the workbench. I could not use an open flame here. The room was classified Class 1 Division 1 explosion hazard. But I was not going to light it. I was going to use the heat gun I kept in the cabinet, but the outlet was dead. The non-essential circuits had been shed by the load controller. I had to use friction and mechanics. I took the screwdriver handle and began to tap the solenoid body rhythmically. Tap, 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 trying to shatter the ice crystal structure inside. It did not move. I needed heat, safe heat. I looked around the room. My eyes landed on the steam trace line running along the wall. It was a copper tube carrying low-pressure steam to keep the instruments warm. I grabbed a roll of aluminum foil tape from the shelf. I tore off a 3-foot strip. I bridged the gap between the hot steam line and the frozen solenoid block with a heavy adjustable wrench, jamming the jaws onto the steam line and pressing the handle against the aluminum block. It was a crude heat bridge. Conduction. I held it there, feeling the heat travel through the steel of the wrench into my gloved hand. I waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. The wrench became uncomfortably hot. Then, a sound. A sharp, pneumatic foot-sh. The solenoid shifted. The air rushed into the other tower. The frost on the first tower began to crackle as the pressure released. The gauge on the wall jumped from 60 to 80, then settled at 90. I let out a breath I did not know I was holding. The valves on the distillation column groaned as they received full pressure again, adjusting themselves to the correct position. The flow stabilized. I was not done. The timer was still dead. I would have to come back here every 4 hours and manually switch the towers, or the system would freeze again. I took a permanent marker from my pocket and wrote on the face of the dryer control panel. Manual cycle, request, 4 hours. I added it to the mental list. Turbines, food, sleep, air dryer. The cycle of my life was tightening. I pocketed the wrench and checked the sample jar again. The fuel was cooling, but it was still clear. No wax crystals precipitating out. We were making good jet fuel. I suited back up, dreading the transition. The walk back to the main building was a battle against the wind, which seemed to have found a new gear. It pushed me sideways, forcing me to grab the handrail of the utilidor entrance to keep from sliding past it. Back inside, I stripped the gear off in the mudroom. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline crash.
I needed water. I walked to the kitchenette in the living quarters. I turned the faucet. Nothing happened. Not a drop. The pipes rattled, a dry, hollow sound. I swore, the word echoing in the empty room. The domestic water pump. The station drew water from a deep well drilled through the permafrost. The water was pumped into a holding tank, then pressurized for the sinks and toilets. If the pump had stopped, it was either power or the pressure switch. I grabbed my multimeter and headed for the mechanical room in the basement of the living quarters. The basement was a labyrinth of insulated pipes and ductwork. The air handler unit was humming, pushing heat upstairs. That was good. But the silence from the corner where the water skid sat was absolute. I approached the blue pressure tank. The gauge read 0.
I opened the control box for the well pump. I set the multimeter to volts AC. I touched the probes to the incoming terminals. 480 volts. The power was there. I moved the probes to the load side of the contactor, the switch that sends power to the pump. 0 volts. The contactor was not pulling in. The computer had commanded the domestic water off as a non-essential load to save power for the emergency heaters. It was a logic decision made by a programmer in a warm office in Anchorage 5 years ago, designed to save the batteries in a blackout. He had not anticipated a man living here during the apocalypse. I looked at the contactor. It was a square block of black plastic with a plunger in the center. I took a plastic zip tie from my bag. I pressed the plunger in with my thumb. It offered stiff resistance, a heavy spring designed to prevent accidental engagement. When it seated, the magnetic coil hummed, and the contacts snapped together with a sharp, mechanical report. Water rushed into the pipes. The pressure gauge climbed. 20 psi. 40 psi. I threaded the zip tie through the mounting bracket and over the plunger, pulling it tight with my pliers until it locked the button in the on position. I had mechanically bypassed the brain. The pump would run until the pressure switch cut it physically, or until the motor burned out. "Drink when you can," I muttered. I went back upstairs and filled 3 5-gallon plastic jugs from the tap. I placed them in the hallway. Strategic reserves. If the well froze or the pump died, I would have 15 gallons. Enough for a week of drinking, if I did not wash. Hygiene was a luxury I was about to abandon. I returned to the control room. It was 1800. The hunger was gnawing at me now. I sat at the console and ate a can of cold ravioli, spooning it directly from the tin. The texture was pasty, the tomato sauce congealed, but the calories burned hot in my stomach. I watched the vibration monitors on the turbines. Unit 1 was purring. Unit 2 was showing a slight tick in the vertical axis on the aft bearing. 8 mils. Not dangerous yet, but it was a loose tooth. I would have to watch it. The sun had long since set. The window was a square of absolute blackness, reflecting the blue light of the monitors and my own tired face. I could not stay awake forever, but if I slept and the turbine tripped, the silence would not wake me fast enough. The sound dampening in the quarters was too good. By the time I felt the temperature drop, the oil in the lines outside might already be gelling. I needed a watchdog. I looked at the console. The alarm horn was disconnected. I opened the drawer and found a roll of duct tape and a heavy steel wrench. I walked to the door of the control room. It was a heavy steel fire door with a lever handle. I balanced the wrench on the very edge of the door handle. It was precarious. If the door moved even a fraction of an inch, the wrench would fall. That would not work. I was not worried about intruders. I was worried about silence. I went back to the panel. I looked at the Unit 2 RPM gauge. It had an analog output, a 420 mA signal that drove the needle. I went to the back of the panel. I found the signal wires for the tachometer. I stripped a spare piece of wire and connected it to a spare relay I found in the bottom of the cabinet. I wired the relay to the overhead lighting circuit for the control room. I adjusted the set point on the relay. If the RPM dropped below 4,000, idle speed, the relay would open. If the turbine tripped, the lights in the control room would shut off. The sudden darkness would wake me faster than any noise. It was a primal trigger. Loss of visual input. I tested it by dialing the set point up until it clicked. The room went black. I dialed it back. The lights flared on. System functional. I dragged a mattress from the sleeping quarters into the control room. I wedged it between the console and the wall. I laid my sleeping bag on it. I did one last walk of the boards. Flow, 500,000 bar PT. Suction pressure, 600 psi. Discharge pressure, 1,100 psi. Topping plant air, 90 psi. Ambient temp, minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit. I lay down on the mattress, fully clothed, boots on. The floor vibrated beneath me, a constant, soothing massage. It was the heartbeat of the monster I was riding. I closed my eyes, but my mind would not shut down. It was tracing the piping diagrams, visualizing the fluid moving through the valves, the electrons racing through the copper, the heat radiating from the fins. I was part of the machine now. I was the wetware component that tightened the nuts and cleared the ice. I drifted into a shallow, fragile sleep. I woke to a sound that was not a machine. It was a dull, heavy thump. I sat up, heart hammering. The lights were still on. The turbines were still running. The vibration was constant. I looked at the clock. 2:15. Thump. It came from the roof. I stood up, grabbing the shotgun from the console. Bears did not climb onto roofs. Not usually. And at 40 below, bears were hibernating. Thump. Scrape. Something heavy was moving on the metal decking of the control building roof. I moved to the window, but the darkness was absolute. I could not see the roof from here. I went to the vestibule. I had boarded up the glass, but I had left a small gap between the plywood sheets, a firing port. I pressed my eye to the gap. The security light on the corner of the building illuminated a patch of snow and the steel ladder that led to the roof. The ladder was vibrating. I racked the slide of the shotgun. The sound was a harsh, mechanical clack that seemed incredibly loud in the small space. I unlocked the inner door and stepped into the airlock. I did not open the outer door yet. I listened. The wind was howling, masking most sounds, but I felt the vibration through the wall. Steps. Heavy, clumsy steps. "Who's there?" I shouted. The sound was swallowed by the wind. No answer. I reached for the handle of the outer door. The plywood I had screwed into the frame made it heavy. I shoved it open. The cold hit me, stealing the breath from my lungs. I stepped out onto the concrete pad, raising the shotgun. I looked up at the roofline. A shape was silhouetted against the stars. It was human. Or it had been. It was wearing a torn parka, flapping in the wind. It stood on the edge of the roof, 20 feet above me, looking down. It did not speak. It did not signal. It just leaned forward. It was not jumping to attack. It was falling. The body hit the snowbank in front of me with a soft, muted impact. It did not move. I kept the gun trained on it.
Stay down! I advanced slowly. The figure was face down in the snow. I used the barrel of the shotgun to prod the shoulder. Rigid. I rolled him over. It was a man I did not know. His skin was blue-white, hard as marble. His eyes were frozen open, crusted with rime. But it was his hands that made me recoil. They were raw, stripped of flesh down to the bone in places. He had climbed the steel ladder bare-handed at 40 below zero. He had climbed until his fingers froze to the rungs and tore away when he moved. He had not been attacking. He had been seeking the heat. He had felt the warmth venting from the roof exhaust and had climbed toward it like a moth to a flame, until the cold simply turned him off. I looked up at the roof. No one else. I looked at the horizon. The emptiness was total. I could not leave him here. The wolves or the wolverines would come, and I did not want them getting a taste for this close to the door. I grabbed the back of his parka. I dragged him toward the edge of the pad, away from the intake vents. The body was light, dehydrated, a husk. I left him by the retaining wall. I would burn him later, when I had the energy to waste fuel. I walked back to the door. My hands were numb inside my gloves. I bolted the door again. I checked the plywood screws. I went back to the control room. I sat on the mattress, shivering violently. The systems were holding. The water was running. The heat was on. But the world outside was trying to get in. It was not just the virus or the zombies or whatever they were. It was the entropy. The cold. It wanted to equalize the temperature. It wanted to make the inside like the outside. I looked at the vibration monitor. Unit 2 was at 9 mils. It had risen 1 in 4 hours. Not yet, I whispered to the machine. Not yet. I lay back down. I kept the shotgun on my chest, my finger resting on the trigger guard. The steel was warming up against my body heat. I closed my eyes and listened to the turbine singing its high, desperate note.
The station did not wake me with a sound. It woke me with a shudder. It was a physical convulsion, a violent lateral jerk that traveled up through the pilings, through the steel frame of the module, and into the mattress on the control room floor. I was awake instantly, my heart hammering against my ribs before my eyes had even adjusted to the darkness. Then the sound arrived. It was not the steady, high-pitched scream of the Rolls-Royce Avon I had grown used to. This was a rhythmic, suffocating cough, a deep, bass-heavy concussion that shook the dust from the ceiling tiles. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. I rolled off the mattress and scrambled to the console, my socks sliding on the linoleum. The emergency lights flickered with each impact, the voltage sagging as the generator struggled to compensate for the massive load swings. The vibration monitor for Unit 2 was no longer a flat line. It was a jagged mountain range of red pixels. Axial displacement 12 mils. Compressor surge detected. Intake differential pressure high. No, 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 I hissed, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Compressor surge is the aerodynamic equivalent of a heart attack. The turbine blades are designed to push air backward, compressing it before fuel is injected. But if the airflow is disrupted, if the intake is choked, the pressure inside the combustion chamber becomes higher than the pressure at the intake. The air violently reverses direction, exploding out the front of the engine. Each whoomp was a backfire of burning jet fuel trying to escape the wrong way. It was a hammer blow to the delicate bearings and titanium blades. If I did not stop it, the engine would tear itself off the mountings.
I reached for the emergency stop button. My finger hovered over the red mushroom cap. If I killed Unit 2, I was down to one engine. Unit 1 could maintain flow, but not at full pressure. The oil would slow down. The friction heat would drop. The wax precipitation point was 100 degrees. The oil leaving the station was currently 108. I had an 8-degree margin. Killing the engine was a last resort. I looked at the anti-ice status on the screen. Bleed air valve, closed. Command, open. Error, valve failure. There it was. The Arctic air outside was minus 45 degrees. It contained suspended moisture, ice fog. As that air was sucked into the turbine intake at hundreds of miles per hour, the pressure drop caused an instant temperature drop. The moisture was flashing into ice, coating the intake screens, building up a solid wall of frost. The automated system should have opened a valve to bleed hot air from the compressor back into the intake to melt it. The valve had failed. Likely the pneumatic actuator had frozen solid, just like the air dryer in the topping plant. Unit 2 was suffocating. I grabbed the radio.
Unit 2 is surging. Ice in the plenum. I'm going outside. I was talking to myself, recording the black box data for a coroner who would never come. I ran to the mudroom. This was not a maintenance check. This was a rescue mission. I did not bother with the mid-layer fleece. I went straight for the heavy parka, zipping it to the chin. I pulled on the balaclava, the wool scratching my neck. I jammed my feet into the boots, skipping the laces on the upper eyelets, just wrapping them tight around the ankle. I grabbed the harness. The intake plenum was 30 feet off the ground, accessed by an external gantry. In this wind, gravity was a predator. I clipped a heavy dead-blow hammer, 4 pounds of lead shot encased in orange urethane, to my belt. I grabbed a pry bar. I looked at the shotgun leaning against the lockers. The surge noises were loud. Whoomp, whoomp. They sounded like explosions. Sound travels far in the cold air. I slung the shotgun across my back, cinching the strap tight so it would not swing. I burst out of the living quarters into the utilidor. The lights in the tunnel were flickering in time with the surge. The whole station was flexing. I could hear the metal groaning, the rivets complaining as the torque spiked and fell. I reached the exterior door. I did not hesitate. I threw the latch and kicked it open. The violence of the storm was absolute. It was not just wind. It was a solid wall of moving air and ice crystals. The gale hit me at 60 miles per hour, instantly blinding me despite the goggles. It felt like being sandblasted. I staggered back, grabbing the door frame, forcing my body weight forward to keep my feet. I turned and leaned my shoulder into the wind, driving my legs like pistons. The turbine hall was 100 yards away. The noise of the surging engine was terrifying from out here. It sounded like a dragon dying in a steel cage. A deep, guttural roaring that culminated in a chest-vibrating concussion every 2 seconds. I reached the base of the intake structure. It was a massive steel box, 3 stories high, standing next to the turbine module. The air was drawn in at the top, filtered and ducted down to the engine. I looked up at the access ladder. It was caked in rime ice, thick and white like cauliflower. I clipped my safety lanyard to the cage of the ladder. I tested the grip. My gloves slid on the ice. I took the pry bar from my belt. I struck the rung at head height. The ice shattered, shards flying into the wind. I struck the next one. I began to climb, a slow, brutal rhythm. Strike, step, clip, strike, step, clip. The wind tried to peel me off the steel. It grabbed the hood of my parka and yanked my head back. My fingers, even inside the heavy mittens, began to ache with a deep,
bone-level throb. I reached the platform level. This was the intake plenum. A row of weather hoods covered the filter banks.
I pulled myself over the railing and unclipped. I crawled on hands and knees across the grating. Standing up here was suicide. The wind was accelerating around the sharp edges of the building, creating localized vortexes that could throw a grown man like a rag doll. I reached the access door to the filter house. It was held shut by the immense suction of the turbine. Even fast asleep, the engine was pulling thousands of cubic feet of air per second. Now, starving, it was pulling a hard vacuum. I could not open the door. The pressure differential was tons of force. I had to clear the weather hoods first. I stood up, wrapping my arm around a stanchion. I looked at the intake screens. They were gone, replaced by a solid wall of white. The rime ice had bridged the gaps in the steel mesh, creating a perfect seal. The turbine surged again. The entire platform jumped under my feet. I heard the metal ductwork booming, a sound like a sheet of thunder trapped in a box. I unhooked the dead blow hammer. I swung. The orange hammerhead impacted the ice-choked screen. The sensation was like hitting a concrete wall. The ice did not shatter. It crunched, compacting. I swung again, harder, putting my back into it. A crack appeared. A spiderweb of fractures in the white mass. I swung a third time. A chunk of ice the size of a dinner plate broke free. Instantly it was sucked into the mesh, held there by the vacuum. "No!" I screamed, the wind tearing the word away. I had to clear it, not just break it. I had to scrape it off. I reversed the hammer and used the pry bar. I jammed the tip into the mesh and levered sideways. A sheet of ice peeled away, tumbling into the wind. The turbine note changed. The pitch rose slightly. It had found a breath. I moved to the next panel. Smash, pry, peel. My arms were burning. The lactic acid built up in my muscles, fighting the cold that was trying to stiffen them. I worked down the line, clearing 4 panels. The surging stopped. The rhythmic whoomp, whoomp smoothed out into a steady, rising whine. The vibration under my boots settled into the familiar, high-frequency buzz. It was stabilizing. I leaned against the railing, gasping for air. The cold burned my throat. I wiped the frost from my goggles. I looked down. The security lights around the perimeter cast a pool of harsh, yellow illumination on the snow. Below me, at the base of the intake structure, they were gathering. There were 5 of them, maybe 6. It was hard to count in the swirling snow. They were huddled against the steel columns, drawn by the heat radiating from the turbine exhaust, drawn by the noise of the dying engine. They were not looking at the heat. They were looking up. At me. The surging had acted like a dinner bell. One of them, a figure in a torn blue coverall, one of ours, maybe a mechanic from the night shift, began to climb the ladder I had just ascended. He moved fast, unnaturally fast. He did not clear the ice. He just clamped his hands over the frozen rungs, ignoring the damage it must have been doing to his skin. I fumbled for the shotgun. My mittens were too clumsy. I bit the tip of the right mitten and tore it off, exposing the liner glove. It offered no thermal protection, but it gave me a trigger finger. I unsung the Remington. I braced it against the railing, aiming down through the cage of the ladder. "Get down!" I shouted. A useless reflex. You do not give orders to a virus. The mechanic reached the halfway point. He paused, lifting his head. His face was a mask of frostbite and dried blood, but his mouth was open, tasting the air. He saw me.
He let out a sound that was not a scream. It was a wet, clicking rattle. He lunged upward, skipping a rung. I disengaged the safety. I lined up the bead sight on the center of the mass. I squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched my shoulder, a dull thud through the layers of the parka. The muzzle flash was a blinding orange sphere in the gray dark. The slug hit him in the upper chest. It did not just stop him, it erased his momentum. He was thrown backward, his grip torn from the ladder.
He fell 15 feet, twisting in the air, and landed on the steel cross bracing below with a sickening, wet impact. He tumbled off into the snow. The others at the bottom did not scatter. They did not flinch. They just watched him fall, then turned their heads back to me. 2 more started to climb. I pumped the slide. Clack, clack. I could not stay up here. The cold was seeping through my boots. My exposed trigger finger was numb, losing sensation. If I stayed to fight a siege, I would freeze before I ran out of ammo. I needed to get back to the utilidor, but the ladder was the only way down, and it was choked with targets. I looked around the platform. There was an emergency escape hatch on the south side, a vertical drop chute that bypassed the ladder. It was designed for fire evacuation. I ran to the hatch. I kicked the release lever. It was frozen. I hammered it with the butt of the shotgun. It did not budge. The first climber was reaching the platform level. I could hear his hands slapping against the steel grating. I turned back to the ladder. The climber's head cleared the floor level. It was a woman, her hair matted with ice. She hissed, scrambling to get her knees over the edge. I stepped forward and kicked her. The heavy rubber toe of the bunny boot caught her square in the face. She fell backward without a sound, taking the climber behind her down with her. I did not wait to see them land. I holstered the shotgun. I grabbed the frozen hatch lever with both hands. I braced my feet against the railing. I pulled with everything I had, screaming with the effort. The rust and ice gave way with a screech of tearing metal. The hatch flew open. I looked down the dock tube. It was a straight drop to a snowdrift on the south side of the module. I jumped. I slid down the plastic chute, gathering speed, plunging into the darkness. I hit the snowbank at the bottom hard, tumbling, burying myself in the powder. I scrambled up, coughing snow. I was on the south side, away from the ladder. I ran. I rounded the corner of the module, heading for the utilidor door. The wind was at my back now, pushing me, helping me flee. I reached the door. I threw myself inside and slammed it, throwing the deadbolt and the secondary latch I had installed. I slumped against the metal, sliding down to the floor. I gasped for air, my lungs burning. I looked at my right hand. The liner glove was soaked with melted snow. My finger was white, waxy. Frost nip. I stripped the glove off. I shoved my hand into my armpit, skin to skin, seeking the heat of my core. The pain as the feeling returned was exquisite, a burning, stinging agony that made my eyes water. But the sound. I listened. The utilidor was vibrating with a steady, high-pitched hum. The turbine was running smooth. I had won. For now. I stood up, my legs trembling. I walked back to the control room, trailing melted snow on the floor. I checked the monitors. Unit 2 vibration, 1. 1 mils. Stable. Intake temp, minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Exhaust temp, 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. The machine was breathing. I looked at the external camera view, the one pointing at the intake structure. The bodies were gone. The snow drifted fast in this wind.
It buried mistakes quickly. I sat in the chair, the adrenaline draining out of me, leaving me hollowed out. I had fixed the immediate crisis, but the underlying problem remained. The bleed air valve was still broken. The ice would come back. Maybe in 12 hours, maybe in 24. I could not climb that tower every day. I could not fight a war on the gantry every time the wind shifted. I needed a permanent fix. I pulled the schematics for the intake system. Bleed air control valve, solenoid, 24 volt. If the solenoid was frozen, I could not fix it from here. But what if I bypassed the control logic entirely? The valve was fail open. That meant if it lost air pressure or power, a spring would force it open to the safe position. Anti-ice on. The computer was sending a signal to keep it closed because the sensor said the engine was efficient. If I cut the power to the solenoid, the valve should spring open. But I had already cut the safety wires. Why was it still closed? I traced the line on the paper. Instrument air supply. The valve needed air pressure to close.
It needed lack of air pressure to open. If the solenoid was frozen in the energized position, it was holding air pressure on the valve, keeping it clamped shut. I needed to bleed the air off the actuator. I looked at the station piping diagram. The instrument air header ran through the turbine hall roof space. There was an isolation valve inside the building, just before the line penetrated the wall to go outside to the intake. If I closed that valve inside the warm turbine hall, I would cut off the air supply to the intake valve. The pressure would bleed off. The spring would force the anti-ice valve open. It would reduce the turbine's efficiency. It would burn more fuel. But it would keep the intake hot. Permanently. I grabbed the ladder. I did not need to go outside. I needed to go into the turbine hall ceiling. I walked back to the turbine hall. The noise was deafening, comforting. I climbed the internal catwalk to the rafters. I found the copper line labeled Intake Anti-Ice Air Supply. There was a small brass ball valve. I reached up. The handle was warm. I turned it 90 degrees. Hiss. A small vent hole in the valve body released the downstream pressure. Outside, unseen, the massive butterfly valve on the engine intake would be slowly groaning open, driven by its heavy spring. Hot air from the compressor would begin to flood the intake plenum, melting the remaining ice, drying the filters. I watched the gauges on the local panel. EGT, exhaust gas temp, rose by 40 degrees. Fuel flow increased. Efficiency dropped. Survival increased. I climbed down. I walked back to the control room. My frost-nipped finger was throbbing with a pulse I could feel in my neck. I looked at the whiteboard. Priorities. Maintain flow. Stable. Secure topping plant. Stable. Inventory calories. Done. Do not freeze. Ongoing. I added a new line. Ammunition conservation. I had fired 1 round. I had 6 left in the tube. The box of shells was in the truck, in the secured bay. I needed to bring it inside. But not tonight. Tonight, I needed to let the pain in my hand remind me that I was made of meat, and the machine was made of steel, and the cold did not care about either of us. I looked at the logbook. Day 1, 2300. Surge event, Unit 2. Manual de-icing required. Hostiles encountered at perimeter. 1 confirmed kill. Anti-ice system forced to continuous operation. Fuel consumption increased by 8%. I put the pen down. I stared at the 8%. That was the new math. I was burning my timeline to buy safety.
The fuel in the tanks would drop faster now. The topping plant would have to work harder. The margins were shrinking. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the wind try to tear the roof off. The crisis was over. The attrition had begun. I closed my eyes, but I saw the woman's face as my boot connected.
The way she fell. Silent. It was not the silence of discipline. It was the silence of something that had nothing to say. I touched the cold steel of the shotgun barrel. "Copy that," I whispered, loud and clear. Time is no longer measured in hours or dates. It is measured in gallons. The station burns 4,200 gallons of refined fuel per day. The topping plant produces 4,500. That gives me a surplus of 300 gallons every 24 hours, a safety margin of roughly 7%. If I sleep too long and the distillation column drifts off spec, that margin vanishes. If the crude oil composition changes and the wax content rises, the filters clog, production drops, and I go into a deficit. If I go into a deficit for 3 days, the day tanks run dry. The turbines trip. The heat dies. The station becomes a monument. I looked at the logbook. I had stopped writing the date. Instead, I wrote the number. Day 42. The silence of the station was different now. In the first week, it was a terrifying void that I tried to fill with radio calls and movement. Now, the silence was a heavy, fluid medium I moved through, like deep water. The roar of the turbines was not noise anymore. It was just the texture of the air. I sat in the mess hall, staring at a bowl of oatmeal made with water from the bypassed well pump. My hands wrapped around the ceramic mug, soaking up the warmth. The coffee was weak. I was rationing the grounds, rebrewing the same slurry twice before discarding it. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. The face looking back was gaunt. The beard was thick, climbing my cheekbones, dusted with gray that had not been there 2 months ago. My eyes looked flat, like the optical sensors on the intake plenum, just recording data, not processing emotion. My right hand, the one I had frost-nipped on the gantry, was a mottled landscape of peeling skin and waxy pink new flesh. It throbbed when the barometric pressure dropped, a built-in storm warning. "Routine," I said aloud. My voice was raspy, unused. "Execute the loop." I stood up, washing the bowl and the spoon. I dried them and placed them in the rack. I kept the kitchen spotless. Disorder was the first step toward giving up. If I stopped washing the dishes, I would stop washing myself. If I stopped washing myself, I would stop checking the vibration monitors. Entropy is a slope, not a cliff. I walked to the utilidor. The long steel hallway was my commute. First stop, the generator room. The primary power for the station did not come from the grid. There was no grid. It came from the crude-fired turbines turning 480-volt generators. But I kept a backup diesel standby generator, a Cat 3512, ready to fire if the turbines tripped. I checked the block heater. The engine was warm to the touch. A sleeping giant kept in a state of artificial readiness. I pulled the dipstick. The oil was black, thick with soot, but the level was perfect. I wiped the stick on a rag and reinserted it. The smell of the oil was comforting, earthy, mineral, real. I moved to the turbine hall. Unit 1 and Unit 2 were screaming in unison. The anti-ice bypass I had rigged in the ceiling was holding. The intake temperatures were high, efficiency was down, but they were breathing. The vibration on Unit 2 had settled at 1.1 mils. It was not getting worse. The machine had accepted its injury and was limping forward.
I walked the length of the hall, running my hand along the yellow safety rail. I touched the casing of the number 1 pump. It was hot, vibrating at 3,000 RPM. "Good morning," I whispered. I did not believe in animism. Machines did not have souls. But they had temperaments. They had habits. And right now, they were the only things keeping the universe from freezing solid. I reached the far door and suited up for the topping plant run. This was the most critical part of the loop. I stepped outside. The wind had died down to a steady 15-knot breeze. The temperature was -28, a heat wave. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun struggling to clear the peaks of the Brooks Range. The light was flat, casting no shadows, robbing the world of depth.
Everything looked like a two-dimensional stage set, painted in shades of gray and blue. I walked the path to the refinery module. I did not carry the shotgun anymore. I had seen no movement at the perimeter for 3 weeks. The dead froze. The living moved on. Or died. The station was a dead zone of noise and heat that offered no food to anything biological. I entered the topping plant. The heat hit me, thick with the smell of sulfur. I checked the differential pressure gauges on the filter banks. Bank A, Delta P, 18 psi. "High," I muttered. The crude coming up the pipe was getting heavier. More wax, more asphalt. It was clogging the sock filters before the distillation column. If the pressure drop got too high, the filters would burst, sending sludge into the heater, fouling the tubes. I had to change the filters. Again. It was a miserable, dangerous job. I isolated filter bank A, turning the heavy hand wheels to divert the flow to bank B. I watched the pressure gauges to confirm the seal. I opened the drain valve on the bottom of the housing. Hot, black sludge hissed out into the slop tank. I waited for the hiss to turn to a trickle. I put on my heavy nitrile gloves, then the leather gauntlets over them. I pulled on the face shield. I took the socket wrench and began to loosen the bolts on the breech lock lid. There were 12 of them. They were hot. The grease on the threads smoked slightly as I turned them. I worked in a rhythm. Turn. Reset. Turn. Reset. My arms burned. The heat in the room was stifling inside the parka, but I could not take it off. If a seal blew, hot crude would spray. The parka was my armor. I swung the heavy steel lid open on its davit arm. The smell of raw hydrocarbons rolled out, a dizzying, organic stench. I reached in and pulled out the filter basket. It was heavy, dripping with black slime. The white cotton socks were caked with a thick, tar-like substance. I dropped the basket into the cleaning solvent drum. I grabbed the box of new filters. I installed them, my fingers slick with oil, fumbling with the retaining clips. I paused. A sound. Not a machine sound. A voice. "Elias." It came from behind me, clear as a bell. I froze, my hand deep in the filter housing. My heart skipped a beat, then slammed against my ribs. I turned slowly, the wrench gripped in my right hand. The room was empty, just the silver insulation of the column, the green paint of the pumps, the steam rising from the trace lines. "Hello," I said. The only answer was the hiss of the steam trap cycling. I closed my eyes for a second. Auditory hallucination, a symptom of isolation. The brain, starved of social input, begins to pattern match random acoustic noise into speech. It was the white noise of the pumps interacting with the fan blades. "You're cracking up, Vance," I whispered. I turned back to the housing. I seated the new filters. I swung the lid shut. I tightened the bolts in a star pattern, torquing them down until my shoulder clicked. I slowly opened the inlet valve. The housing groaned as it pressurized. I checked the flange for leaks. Dry. I opened the outlet. The flow resumed. Bank A, Delta P, 2 psi. Clean. I wiped my gloves on a rag. I looked at the solvent drum where the old filters were soaking. The black fluid swirled, iridescent patterns forming on the surface. I was not cracking up. I was just lonely. And the part of me that was lonely was dying, starved out by the part of me that was an engineer. I left the refinery and walked back to the main building. The day passed in the usual increments. 12 o'clock. Check satellite link. Dead. 13 o'clock. Lunch. Canned tuna, crackers. 14 o'clock. Inspect the battery bank in the UPS room. Specific gravity check. 16 o'clock. Exercise. I did push-ups on the floor of the control room. 100 in sets of 20. I did squats. I lifted a heavy toolbox, curling it like a dumbbell. I needed to keep the muscle mass. The cold ate calories, but it also ate strength. If I became too weak to turn a valve wheel, I died. At 18 o'clock, the sun was gone. The darkness was absolute. I sat at the console. The green line on the flow monitor was hypnotic. 500,000 barrels. Where was it going? Valdez was the terminal, 800 miles south. The tanks there held millions of barrels.
But if the tankers were not loading, the tanks would be full. If the tanks were full, the relief valves would lift, or the operators at the terminal, if any were left, would have shut the main gate. If the gate at Valdez was closed, the line packed. The pressure would rise, backing up north like a shockwave. But the pressure here was steady. That meant the oil was going somewhere. Maybe the tanks were overflowing into the containment berms. Maybe someone was still loading ships. Or maybe the pipe had ruptured somewhere in the Yukon River Valley, and I was pumping 500,000 barrels of crude into the wilderness every day. I thought about that. The environmental catastrophe. The EPA regulations. I laughed. A dry, barking sound that startled me. It did not matter. The biosphere was already rewriting itself. The oil was heat. Heat was life. As long as I kept the oil moving, the artery was warm. I reached for the radio handset. I had not transmitted in 10 days. I keyed the mic. CQ, CQ, CQ. This is Pump Station 4, Kilo Alpha 7 Zulu, monitoring emergency frequencies. I released the button. The static hissed. A wash of cosmic noise and atmospheric interference. Then, a break. Chick. Static. South. Broken. Static. I sat up straight, pressing the headset to my ears. Station calling. Say again. This is Pump Station 4. Chick. Weather. Avoid. It was not a conversation. It was a fragment of a looped broadcast, bouncing off the ionosphere from thousands of miles away. Maybe a frantic automated warning from a weather buoy in the Pacific. Maybe a recording from a ghost station in the lower 48. It faded back into the white noise. I set the headset down. It was not hope. It was just evidence that the laws of physics still applied. Radio waves still propagated. I turned my chair to face the window. I could not see anything, but I knew what was out there. The bodies. The man who froze on the roof. The woman I kicked off the ladder. The mechanic I shot. I had dragged them all to a depression in the ground near the flare pit. I could not dig a grave. The ground was permafrost, hard as concrete. I had covered them with a heavy tarp weighted down with rocks. They were my crew now. The silent shift. I wondered if I would join them. If the turbine threw a blade tomorrow, if the fire suppression system dumped the halon and suffocated me, if I slipped on the ice and broke a femur, I would crawl to the warmth. I would die close to the engine. I opened the desk drawer. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a map I had drawn. I had calculated the fuel range of the F-350. With the auxiliary tank, I could make it to Fairbanks. But Fairbanks was a city. Cities were graveyards. Cities were where the clusters were. Here, I had walls. I had heat. I had purpose. I crumpled the map. I did not throw it away.
I just smoothed it out again and put it back. It was a fantasy, like reading a travel brochure. I stood up and walked to the whiteboard. Priorities. Maintain flow. Do not freeze. Endure. I erased endure. I wrote exist. Endurance implied a finish line. Existence was a state of being. I walked to the living quarters. I went to the library shelf in the recreation room. It was stocked with paperbacks left by decades of shift workers. Tom Clancy, Stephen King, Louis L'Amour. I pulled out a worn copy of a technical manual. Gas Turbine Maintenance and Overhaul, 4th edition. I sat on the couch. I opened it to Chapter 6, Combustion Liner Inspection. I read the words I already knew by heart. Inspect for thermal stress cracking. Check crossfire tubes for blockage. The technical language was a liturgy. It ordered the world. It said that if you do A, B will happen. It promised cause and effect. I read until my eyes burned. At 2200, I did my final rounds. I walked the perimeter of the modules. I checked the bolts on my plywood barricades. They were frosted over, the wood delaminating slightly from the cold, but they held. I went to the generator room. I checked the oil level again. Perfect. I went to the turbine hall. I stood in front of Unit 2. The vibration was a steady massage through the soles of my boots. You and me, I said. I placed my hand on the control cabinet. I thought about Miller, the controller in Anchorage. He had tried to kill the station to save the watershed. He had followed the protocol. I had broken the protocol. I had chosen the machine over the rules. I realized then that I was not just maintaining the station. I was the station. The copper wiring of the control panels was my nervous system. The hydraulic fluid was my blood. The crude oil was my heat. I was not stuck here. I was installed here. I walked back to the control room. I checked the watchdog relay I had rigged, the one that would cut the lights if the RPM dropped. It was armed. I lay down on the mattress. I closed my eyes. I did not dream of rescue. I did not dream of helicopters or warm beaches. I dreamed of the pipeline. I saw it from high above, a silver thread stitching the white world together. I saw the oil moving inside it, hot and black and heavy. I saw it passing through my station, picking up pressure, picking up heat, and pushing on into the dark. I saw the other stations, north and south, dark and silent, frozen solid. Tombs of ice and steel. But Station 4 was glowing. A single ember in the ash. I woke up. It was 6:11, day 43. I got up. I made the coffee. I checked the flow rate. 500,000 barrels. I walked to the window and wiped the condensation from the glass. The sun was just a rumor of light in the east. I saw a wolf standing on the ridge of the snow berm near the main gate.
It was a massive timber wolf, its coat gray and white, blending with the twilight.
It was not looking at the gate. It was looking at the exhaust plume rising from the turbine stack. It watched the heat. I watched the wolf. We stood there for a long time, two survivors acknowledging the only currency that mattered. Then the wolf turned and trotted away into the white blur of the tundra. I turned back to the console. The service interval light for the Unit 1 auxiliary gearbox blinked yellow. I picked up my tool bag. I picked up the grease gun. "Copy that," I said. I walked out of the control room, down the hall, and into the roar. There was work to be done.